Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our September webinar. As you can see from the title, we will be talking about different ways to understand and overcome stagnation in therapy. And not just in therapy, also if you're on this journey alone and you're doing this as a kind of self-help, stagnation is an issue you're bound to have to face. So we will be talking about different ways to understand it, how you get to that point, and then what is it you can do to get out of it and continue to change at a faster pace. Before we start the webinar, I wanted to remind everyone to vote for the topic for next month. Once I'm done with the webinar, I will close the poll and then we will see what topic was elected. So stay tuned for that. So I don't have any other special announcements. So let's continue let's start with the webinar. If only it would move to the next slide. Okay, so let's consider sort of how you get or how we all get to that stage in therapy where we stagnate and where we don't continue to change. Everyone who comes to therapy, in my experience, or almost everyone, let's say those people who are actually ready to work on the problem that they have, they come to therapy with precisely this attitude, which is, I will do whatever it takes as long as I resolve the problem that I have. In this case, that would be skin picking. So that's how most of my clients come to therapy. There are clients who come to therapy, but aren't quite ready to do whatever it takes, or maybe aren't ready to do much at all. And these clients don't tend to stick around very long. They discover their lack of motivation at the very beginning. So this is not the class of clients I'm talking about. Here, I'm talking about people who start off therapy reasonably motivated and really understanding that skin picking is a serious issue that they want to address. So that's how it starts. They start with enthusiasm and determination, and then they say, I will do whatever it takes to change. And then we start peeling off the layers and we start working. Contrary to what movies would have you believe, therapy really is very hard work. And it takes an emotional toll. Sessions can be excruciating and very difficult and painful. And sometimes, especially for conditions like skin picking, which have to do with avoiding certain emotions, being with that emotional heaviness in therapy is quite important. At Skin Pick, when we do therapy in writing. So this doesn't diminish the emotional impact. The questions that we ask can provoke very emotional responses. But when you're starting therapy, you are full of enthusiasm and you see that emotional burden of therapy as being worthwhile. In other words, you're full of energy to work really hard at it. So you start learning, you write back to your therapist, you write these long posts and several paragraphs or pages long. You offer your own materials that spontaneously produce things that your therapists don't ask you about. You submit your messages and then you continue to think about skin picking, analyze it, compare it to other conditions, see what you've done in the past. Simply put, the beginning of therapy is always full of enthusiasm, even if it is difficult. In fact, sometimes when people start therapy and they realize how difficult the process is, they will even kind of minimize or even dismiss the emotional weight as something that is only temporary, something that gets easier. And it doesn't. It doesn't actually get easier in terms of how emotionally difficult it is, because therapy is, change is an emotional process. And also a part of a skill that we have to acquire in therapy is to be able to tolerate our emotions. Once this insight sets in, there tends to be a slight diminishing of enthusiasm for therapy. So in the beginning, as you start kind of analyzing your picking and thinking about it and collecting information and implementing your first techniques, you still feel like therapy is a rewarding process for you. You feel like you're advancing, you're seeing your progress. Usually what happens is that clients will somehow, throw themselves into learning beyond what we learn, what I teach them at SkinPick and what we discuss. They go, on Google and then find all kinds of studies and other people's experiences. They're willing to try out different supplements, dietary regimes, what you name it. They're willing to try all kinds of things. You start understanding your problems because through your interaction with the therapist, you're starting to kind of build an intellectual framework that explains your skin picking. So your own problems start to slowly make sense. You get an inkling of what's underneath your picking, at least intellectually. And you're still feeling hopeful that you can deal with it rather easily because you have this intellectual clarity about it. You make also some practical advances and you reduce your picking, right? Because usually when we start treatment with habit reversal training, which is a behavioral intervention. So in a matter of a few weeks, we will implement some practical techniques. So you get to see practical results. And this is really good and it's very empowering. The trouble is the kinds of expectations that we form at that stage of therapy, or the expectations that we come in with, how we conceptualize the problem, and the pace of change that we expect. Change in therapy is kind of always topsy-turvy. It's up and down. It's like one step forward, one step backward. It's never linear. You never go from being bad to better and then completely cured. In over a decade of working as a therapist, I have never seen that in my life. So there's always ups and downs. However, in this period, when you're noticing all the positive changes that you're making, you don't seem to pay that much attention to those aspects of change, right? And to how change requires these daily things. You need repetition, you need practice, you need to fail, then analyze, learn from failure, fall, get up again, continue, try again. In the beginning, when you see those small movements, all of these things seem completely irrelevant. But as therapy progresses, this slightly changes. Especially when people start implementing competing responses and stimulus control techniques, they may start working right away, or at least for most people they do. Maybe not the first competing response you choose, but the second one for sure. And what happens then inevitably is that there is a relapse. The first relapse might be demoralizing, but most people are willing to look past it, get up and try again. But the second time that things don't go the way that they had planned, things start to slowly change. Enthusiasm slowly starts to diminish. The third relapse, pessimism slowly creeps in. And this is how we slowly, gently enter the stagnation stage in therapy. So why is it that we come to this point in therapy where you don't feel like you're making any more progress? And in fact, you may feel like you're moving backwards and things are worsening once again. What is it that contributes to this? Basically, the outline that I just gave you shows like a rise of enthusiasm and then a positive change, first in insight and then also reduction in picking. And then you reach a kind of plateau. So the question is, why do we reach this plateau and for how long can that go? Right. So to answer that question, you have to ask another question, which is, what do you expect to achieve and how far are you willing to go? Or to put in different terms, how fast do you expect to change and what are you willing to pay to achieve that change? And this is where most of the time I see the reason for stagnation. If you have high expectations of yourself, especially if you are a perfectionist, perhaps you set the bar so high that suddenly no matter what you do isn't enough anymore. I see this sometimes uh, whenever our clients start a new session in the program, there's an assessment test that they can take. And so you can see how the intensity of your symptoms changes from session to session. And then perfectionists are very disciplined, at least in the beginning. You know, they want to be the best and they want to be perfect. So they really dedicate themselves. And then in the first couple of weeks, they will experience a big drop in their symptom intensity, or to put it in more positive terms, they pick a lot less in a very short period of time. Some people will come to therapy saying, this is going to be a black and white thing for me. So from today, no more picking for me. Like, I'm done. As I move through therapy, I will not pick at all. So they basically start from zero. And then their expectations just go from there upwards. And unfortunately, as I already said, that's not how we typically change as human beings. So this really doesn't go just for skin picking, but for any type of change. And then if you set expectations that are not realistic, what is a normal pace in therapy, and what is perfectly expected from my point of view as a therapist, at least, might seem completely as a failure to someone else. If you want to pick less every week with no exceptions and no changes and no relapses, then once you experience a relapse, or you have a, I don't know, stressful week at work, something comes up, you feel anxious, you pick a little more, you're going to see that as being a failure. Whereas from my point of view as a therapist, I just see that as life, right? So very high expectations are also very likely to get you into that stage of stagnation rather quickly. What happens frequently is that people, as they kind of go deeper and unlock more and more layers underneath their picking, they start realizing that they become overwhelmed and emotionally exhausted from therapy. I mean, it is hard to dive in and look at all these dark corners of our psyche that we would prefer didn't exist, and most certainly prefer that never to look at them, right? So that can become overwhelming and emotionally exhausting. What's overwhelming frequently is that you see one problem being linked to another, and then to another, and to another. Just in the past week, 2 of my clients wrote about this extensively, about how they're starting to realize that picking isn't just a matter of replacing it with other habits, that it's also a matter of reducing the overall stress that they have in their lives. And that means, you know, reducing their working hours, which then possibly has implications for how their career will develop. We don't know that for sure, but that is their fear and their anticipation. And then they come to a point where they realize that, okay, then I have to change my priorities in life. And it really gets very overwhelming very quickly, because you have to question a lot of things. And then there are people who want to be as efficient as possible when it comes to change. And then they start up like 4 or 5 parallel tracks of changing. So they will practice their competing responses, implement their stimulus control, work on their stress reduction, talk about their childhood issues, work on their boundaries. And when you start changing 5, 6, 7, 8 areas of your life at the same time, that really is bound to be overwhelming. And then once that overwhelm happens, you sort of drop everything at once. The same way you picked everything up, you just drop all of it. And then you maybe work on it a little bit. Sometimes you'll choose one topic, spend a few days with it, then choose another one. Basically, you make no progress in either one of the areas where you want to change, but you work on all of them a little bit. So you feel like you're investing your energy continuously, or as much energy as you have left, but you feel like you're not getting enough in return. And then what in effect happens is stagnation, because you don't see any significant psychological changes, and the small changes that you see, you're more likely to neglect as this phase continues to last. And then when it comes to symptom reduction, again, you don't see any significant symptom reduction, but you do see every failure along the way, even if it's a small one. And that makes it seem like it's just not worth it. And then you try even less, and then you continue to stagnate. I guess we can add to this another thing, which is that we typically have a kind of filter that amplifies the negative. So just by default, most people will notice their failures more than their successes. So to stay motivated, you have to work extra hard in certain situations, because you're bound to see failures with greater clarity and give them more importance than they actually have to have. Often people come to some really difficult insights and touch upon difficult topics that they're not quite willing to explore, and then they just feel reluctant to dig any deeper. But at the same time, they feel like therapy requires them to dig deeper, which is, maybe not true in every case. Some people are just happy with habit reversal training, but in my experience, most clients aren't. So they understand that they need to dig deeper, but at the same time, they really don't want to. So they continue to respond to every message. They continue to attend all the support groups, like they show up. They seemingly do all the work, but actually they go to therapy. But when they do, they kind of avoid the actual work that should be done. So it's kind of like those people that formally do everything right, but don't actually go deeper into a topic. When this happens, usually people come to this point where they look back at their last couple of months or weeks or perhaps even years for some people, and they say, well, what have I been doing exactly? And is this really worth it? Whereas in reality, they've been just kind of going through the motions and saying things without really taking them in, and without using therapy as means of transformation, more as just means of communication. And then sometimes people come to a point where they have to choose between reducing picking and then making certain radical, difficult changes that may have to, even in some, like I mentioned an example before, how you go from I have to reduce my stress to maybe I won't achieve my career goals in only a couple of steps. And sometimes when people come to that point and say, well, am I willing to give up my career, or at least the, certain parts of my career, or my imaginary timeline, like when I have to achieve certain career goals, or do I want to give up picking? Suddenly they're not so sure anymore. I've had a client once who actually chose to continue picking. It was a fully conscious decision, simply because they didn't want to sacrifice their career. And in therapy, they came to the realization that working 12, 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, was simply too much for their body and for their mind. And picking was a way to cope with it, a dysfunctional way for sure, but a way to cope with it. And then choosing between continuing to pick and giving up on their career, they simply chose to continue to pick. That, at least, it may not be the healthiest choice, it may not be the choice I would make, but it certainly is an honest choice. The kinds of situations that I'm talking about here is when people aren't really sure which way they want to go. So they're standing on the crossroad and try to walk both ways. So they'll try to go to therapy without making the changes, but they're also trying to reduce picking. That usually turns out to be a rather futile and energy draining balancing act that they do. But while they're doing the balancing act, they're stagnating. So those are four. As I was preparing the webinar, I was going through my old clients and just kind of looking at those that I remember that have experienced significant periods of stagnation. Those are some of the most common reasons that I've seen. If you have your own theory about why you stagnate in therapy, or just in your own work, trying to change and reduce picking, you can write that in the comments. I would be happy to read them. I'm sure that people would like to hear other perspectives as well, because I can't really include every conceivable perspective in just one webinar. Someone might be able to, but not me. And then once we reach that point, a kind of desperation happens. To make things worse, when people start to notice that they're stagnating, and or at least that their motivation is maybe not as strong as it was before. In my experience, most of my clients are intelligent enough to understand when they're actively, using therapy, but not using the insights to change. So they know that period. It's usually when conversations in therapy start becoming more intellectual, hypothetical. Every week they'll bring another theory to the table, or they will write about insights that they've had. But we both know on a certain level that these aren't actual insights. This is just regurgitating the insights that they've already had before, and now they're kind of trying to appear as if they're doing something. This is not a show that anyone puts up for me as a therapist. It's usually a show that every person puts up for themselves. And to be sure, when I was in my own therapy, when I was doing my training, I've had periods when I would decide to change something, then realize that it's much more difficult than I had anticipated. And then I start to intellectualize just to give myself the illusion that I'm actually doing something. But when I look back at that period of my life, I realized that I was talking about something very intensely in therapy, thinking about it, reading about it, but I wasn't actually doing anything. And then as that kind of slowly sets in, as all these defense mechanisms fall away, what usually happens is a lot of frustration, sometimes anger, desperation even. This is a part of a painting that's actually called desperation. The number one mistake that I think people make in this stage in their change is not to share that with their therapists. I wonder sometimes, I know that there are some clients that don't want to share that with me because they would feel like they feel like I would think of them as failures. And then they choose to allow me to continue to think about them in the way that they want, like they're good clients who work hard and change. And then sometimes they're genuinely afraid to share. I had one client where I noticed that they've been stagnating for a while, and then since they weren't, usually I will wait for a client to bring up a topic like this because I think it's very important for clients to be able to share these things with me, but they weren't. So at some point I decided that I should address this, gently and in a roundabout way. And what happened was that client agreed with me and said, well, I was out of ideas and I was afraid to ask because to tell you about this and to ask for any kind of new ideas or new approaches to therapy, because I was afraid you were going to tell me I have nothing for you. And then I would not only be disappointed in myself, I would also be disappointed in you. And I thought, how interesting that someone would be reluctant to ask something from a therapist just so that they would continue to think of their therapist as being a good therapist without actually testing this. So when this stage comes, whatever your reasons may be for not sharing, just in advance, you should know that those are not valid reasons. Absolutely the right thing to do if you have a therapist, or I don't know, if you're a part of a support group or you have an accountability partner, a coach, whatever, whoever you may be working with, the first thing to do when you notice that you're stagnating is to share it with them. And there are a few reasons why this is important. Number one is that they might have a solution because they might see something you don't see. Second of all, your stagnation may be a matter of your perspective, not necessarily a fact. Especially if you tend to notice your flaws and those things that you do wrong more than those things that you do right. I've had a client a couple of months ago that complained about stagnating in therapy, and she felt really bad about herself for not progressing enough. And then I told her, just look at your assessment scores. You've reduced your picking by almost 50% in about 2 months. How is this stagnation? in my mind, in the mind of research and statistics that we have, that's actually far above the average. That's very good. You've reduced your picking by half in 2 months. Where's the stagnation? And she said, yeah, but for the past 2 weeks, my assessment scores were not dropping very quickly. And then I explained that this is quite natural, because there will be like a layer of picking that is very easy to deal with, especially when it's focused picking, and then you need to replace it, you know how to be proactive, you know what you need to do to get rid of it. But then there's still that automatic picking, which is more stubborn, requires more awareness and more patience. So from my point of view, she wasn't stagnating at all. She was just kind of entering a new stage of therapy, or going one level up, to put it that way. So your therapist might offer a perspective that actually changes your idea that you're stagnating. And the third thing is that when you address stagnation, it allows you to actually analyze it. I will tell you some ways in which you can end this, like ways in which you can get out of this period on your own. And then I'll also offer you 2 ways in which you can analyze, in which you can actually kind of analyze the process of change that you're going through, and then see where is it that you're stuck, or at least where is it you're not progressing as fast as you would like to. And that will help you narrow down what you need to do and what direction you need to take. And it might also give you some insight into why you're stagnating, or rather, what change are you resisting right now. So let's see what we can do to shorten or get rid of this stage. First is to just kind of go back to the beginning of therapy, to the very foundations, to what brought you to therapy. First of all, remind yourself, why did you start therapy? Or if, again, as I said, if you're doing this on your own, why did you start doing this? But not in a way like, because the obvious answer is because I want to, stop doing this to myself, or, I don't want to have scars, or I don't want to infect my skin, or I don't want to damage my skin permanently. I don't mean that. I mean, sit and really reflect what values you have that guide you through this process. Or what kind of a person, but in very specific details, you want to be once you're done with therapy. This reminds me of that webinar about willpower and discipline, and how intention is very frequently there to help you with discipline. Instead of pushing yourself through the process using willpower, instead what you do is you use intention to choose a specific direction that is good for you. Sometimes when we're stuck and when we're focused on our failures, and when we start to suffer and feel horrible because of these failures, we lose sight of why are we in this process. So you can also go down another route, which is see what goals you want to achieve and how skin picking links into these goals. But I think personally that kind of deciding what your intention for the process is much better, because of that trap of setting unrealistic goals. If you set unrealistic goals when it comes to treatment, I mean, who's to say that you don't set unrealistic goals in other areas of your life as well? So in that sense, it's much better to think of values and, the kind of person you want to be, and then use that as a guide. If you're not in this stage yet, if you're still, rather enthusiastic about change, or if you were in this stage and then, I don't know, you gave up and you're trying to start again, what you can do actually is write a letter in advance, a letter to yourself when you're in stagnation. I think it was last month or the month before, we talked about in one of the Q&As, we talked about making a self-soothing kit, and I sent out instructions to people who were on the call on how to make it. One of the things that you put inside the self-soothing kit are these like messages for yourself, messages that will help you help remind you why you're doing this, to give you the reason to stop, to give you some comfort, to remind you of certain things that you may forget in those moments when urges become overwhelming. And you can use and create something similar for this stage. So you can prepare yourself proactively for that time in your change process when you start to stagnate by writing a letter to yourself. Like you can, I have clients title that letter usually something like a letter to my stagnating self, or to open in the moment of desperation, or something along those lines. And then in that letter, in a very compassionate and kind way, so by choosing your words very carefully, you explain to yourself and remind yourself of all the reasons why you want to change. You tell yourself, why are you on this journey, and what kind of a person do you want to become as you go through the journey? You remind yourself of the kind of person you're becoming every time you kind of skip an obstacle and move forward. When I do this with my clients, I usually ask them to write this and then to show it to me, and then we discuss it, and then sometimes they make some final changes before they finalize it. Then they write it down on a piece of paper or print it, whatever they prefer, put it in an envelope, and then keep it in a visible place, like in your office or near the TV, or any of these places where you might be tempted to pick. So also where you might be tempted to be terribly frustrated. And then when the time comes, you open the letter. Some of my clients use pictures as well to illustrate what they would be like, not just what their skin will look like, but sometimes I don't know if you've ever thought about like who you want to be once you're done with therapy, or who you want to become in 5 years independently of therapy. But sometimes you can see an image, but it's very hard to put it into words. Like you can see a person with a specific posture, and you can look at that, the way they're standing or moving, and you think, yeah, this is what I want to be. This is why images are very useful to put into. So you need to have a source of motivation, in other words, that it can be intention or your goals. Whereas I think goals are quite useful, and then they can move you well enough. If you have a tendency to set goals and expectations very highly, maybe go with intention, because intention is always more ethereal, leaves more room for variation. So it's less likely that you'll end up disappointed. The point of this is not to frustrate you even more. If you ever used mind mapping, this can be a very useful tool. In fact, this is something that we might actually, we might have a webinar at some point. I may put it on the list, how you can use mind mapping to understand your own picking better, because I use this with clients sometimes, and it gives them a lot of clarity when they break it up that way. Like it's a very simple process. And what you can do is consider different components of your treatment and in general of the process of change. Like what are the different levels of change that you need to make or expect yourself to make. And then you break it down into very concrete and specific actions. And then you will see, as you're making the mind map, especially if you color code it and if you know how to illustrate it well, which I don't, you can see exactly where you're stuck. You will see that some branches will be full and well elaborated, and you will be happy with how they're working. And that way you will narrow down where is it that you're resisting change. You will have a visual representation of those areas where you need to put in extra work, or at least find a different approach. Because sometimes stagnation is not just a matter of you overall not being able to reduce picking further. It could be just one thing in the whole batch of things that you're doing that's very hard for you. And then because you don't want to move on that one specific issue, everything else might suffer. So mind mapping can help you narrow down the process. And then also just making a mind map and seeing all the things that you've tried and things that actually work for you can be quite motivating and rewarding in itself. You can make a timeline. I like this quite a lot, and sometimes I use this not in SkinPick, the program, because it's difficult to do, but with clients in my private practice, I will have them create timelines, like similar to mind map, like visually. I will have them illustrate a timeline of when they started picking, when it got worse, when it got better, all the remissions that they've experienced, and then I will have them mark what tools they've been using to achieve whenever their picking was under control. What did they do to put it under control? When it wasn't under control, what life events took place? Also, what they stopped doing, so that we can have, I like that kind of an overview, because when we start therapy and started from that place, we already have a very good idea of what triggers you, what makes it better, what tools work for you. So it's like a good starting point. And then I will have them add another section to this, which is how therapy happened. When is it that you felt enthusiastic about it? When is it that you didn't? What insights did you have at a given moment? What topics were you working on? What was happening in your life? And then you can make appropriate connections there as well. Mind maps might be a little clearer, but this also works very well, and it's very rich with information. Again, I mentioned writing a letter. I highly suggest that you do this anyway when you start working on something new, because it is really, it really does work well as a technique. Just make sure when you do write, if you do write a letter, to not include any shoulds or musts, and to be very kind and very compassionate, because you will be reading it in a moment when you will need comfort and soothing. So use appropriately comforting and soothing words. If it's hard for you to be kind to yourself, imagine you're writing it to someone else, because it's very easy for most of us to be kind to our friends and loved ones. To ourselves, not so much. This is another approach, how you can map out where you are in the process and identify why is it that you're stagnating. So this is only a part of the whole. I made a list with a client, and this is about half of it. So what we do here is we break up the process into components. So here you have three. You have competing responses, you have emotional awareness, and you have daily mindfulness. And this is for one specific client, so it will be different from others. This client had other items on the list. I just put the three because the point is to illustrate how this technique works, not necessarily to give a full case report. So she chose emotional awareness. Competing responses, I believe, are an obvious one. She chose emotional awareness as being very important because over the years, she suffered a very traumatic event in her childhood. And not only that, but she kind of struggled with people believing her. And so it was kind of like one trauma on top of another trauma, and then a lot of feelings of rejection. And this all took place when she was relatively young. And one of the coping strategies that she developed was dissociation. So when we started working together, emotional awareness was really not even close to where it was supposed to be. And that was, in a way, a defense mechanism, because whenever she would dip into her emotions, they would be very intense and very overwhelming. So over the years, she kind of distanced herself from them. However, that would come up as skin picking, very intense skin picking. So she recognized this early on as a skill that she would need to learn. And then the third one was daily mindfulness, because that was her way of dealing with stress and anxiety. Because we were discussing, as I always do with my clients, short-term techniques and then long-term techniques. Short-term techniques like breathing exercises, she would do very well. They were on the list as well, but because the distance between now and where you are ideally wasn't very big, I didn't include it in the list. But that would be a short-term way. And then she noticed that, meditating daily was quite helpful. So she wanted to include that as well. Then I had her first mark where she wants to be ideally, like once she's done with therapy, once she's in a, like, let's say in a place where she wants to be. And so she marked those ideally spots. As you can see, for example, for competing responses, on the scale of not using them at all to using them so that they replace picking completely. Even in her ideal outcome, it's not that they have to replace picking completely, just as you can see most of the time, or rather an overwhelming amount of time. So they need to work well enough, but not necessarily perfectly. I think this is a very reasonable way of setting expectations. But look, and then when I asked her to mark where she is now in the process, when in the part of therapy when she began to stagnate, there she was. She was a little over halfway there. But this distance between the final goal and where she is now is not so sorry. I don't know why my brain is just mush today. So my point was is it doesn't matter where the now is on this entire scale. What matters is the difference between now and where she ideally wants to be. When you want to narrow down what you need to work on specifically to overcome stagnation, you need to find an area that has the biggest distance. Even though this is quite a distance, compared to the other two, it's not actually that bad. So she is doing decently well here. When you can see emotional awareness, there's a much bigger gap. Her goal is not to be mindful of her emotions all the time, but certainly it is to be mindful most of the time. Whereas in reality, at the time when we were analyzing her stagnation, she had very little emotional awareness. This is a client who really liked evaluations, so we did this several times, like every month and a half or so, every 5 sessions. This would range. The farthest that she went, I think, was about halfway through. And when we talked about this and analyzed this part, we realized that she can maybe come, I hope you can see my mouse, she can maybe come here, like halfway through. But when she gets to that point, she then suddenly starts becoming overwhelmed with her emotions. So she chooses to move back. That means she develops her awareness to a certain point and then goes back. With mindfulness, ideally, she would like to do it daily because she was meditating for, I think, 2 months almost every day. And it really worked very well for her. And then when she started experiencing this stagnation, she became disillusioned a little bit with the process. And then she just dropped it as a habit and would meditate like a couple of times a week, or maybe when she feels anxious as a relaxation technique, which is not exactly the best use of mindfulness. It can be useful, but reducing acute anxiety is really not where mindfulness excels at. So this is where she labeled as now. So not as bad as emotional awareness, but still not, there's not very much meditating being done. And then when you look at the difference between now and ideally for emotional awareness and for mindfulness, at least when I look at them like this, they seem to be almost the same. And so we talked about why is it that these two are similar. So in this case, we couldn't isolate one thing, but we could isolate 2 things. And then for mindfulness, she also told me something that she hadn't told me before, which is that in those times, she would meditate usually in the afternoon. And then she said that when she was tired, she would notice that she would get sometimes very intense emotions, a kind of very vague anxiety. And then when she would stay with that anxiety for a very long time, she would start to get flashbacks to the traumatic event that she had experienced. So that naturally led to less meditation. And then, of course, that kind of correlates with emotional awareness. I already explained how that one worked. So these two turned out to be both related to her trauma. So that naturally led us one step further, which is that before she can continue to progress the way she would like to with her picking, there are areas of that traumatic experience that weren't addressed appropriately previously. Before me, she had a therapist that she had been seeing, I think, for 2 years or something, or quite a long time, or maybe almost 2 years. And trauma was their main area of work. But apparently there were some tales left unresolved that would keep her back. So that's why she was stagnating, because the tools that would help her reduce picking even further would at the same time be those tools that would bring her closer to the trauma that she wasn't ready to work through or hasn't worked through in her previous experience with therapy. So from this, I hope you can see how working on trauma should actually be primary. In that case, saying I will reduce my picking and I will stay at this reduced level, and it won't reduce any further until I deal with this other issue. For my client, that was a worthy trade-off to make. And so her stagnation in terms of how her picking reduced is not something that was done. It was not, the stage didn't end very quickly, but we did work through the traumatic issue in a couple, we stabilized her enough so that she can continue meditating regularly and then continue to work on her picking. So it took a little bit of a detour. And that detour back to the traumatic event is something that we took several times as we were working together. And it was almost like every time she would discover another aspect of the trauma, she would become ready to tackle it. Then she would come back to the picking, then she would chip away a little bit more from the trauma, then come back to work more on the picking. And it was essentially a circle, and it functioned that way. So in this case, the reason for stagnation was another bigger issue. So let's see some other practical instructions. Oh, by the way, this is not something that you only have to do in therapy. You can do this on your own as well. This is not a very difficult technique to do. And it's rather simple. It takes a couple of minutes to draw all this, but it gives you quite a lot of information. If you like to journal, all of these can be, each of these points individually can be a journaling prompt for you. So there's quite a lot that you can get from this. So the first and the most basic thing to do is, as soon as you notice you're stagnating, talk to your therapist about it. So don't be shy, share all the thoughts and all the feelings about it that you have. If you think it's your therapist's fault, or at least a byproduct of how you've been working together, see if you can find a new strategy, see if you can identify an underlying issue. You can create an assessment such as the ones that I've shown. That can be your way of working through this. If all else fails, you can also try and change your therapist. This is not something that I would recommend as your first choice, because I don't think changing therapists should be a decision that one makes lightly. First and foremost, because a therapeutic relationship is meant to be intense. You're meant to not like your therapist. You're meant to have conflicts with your therapist. That's called negative transference, and it's absolutely central to the therapeutic relationship. If you've been through, any longer therapy and you were never annoyed by your therapist, I would be willing to bet that there's something there left to resolve, because we have, and this goes for most people, myself included, we all have the tendency to idealize our therapists in the beginning, because we see them as these people who know how to deal with our issues, like people who know what the solution is and what the answer is. And then it's quite normal to be frustrated by those people when they don't give us the answers that we expect them to give us. Because mostly what people expect therapy to be isn't what therapy actually is. So there is this process of being kind of gradually disillusioned, but it is a good thing, because you're changing your relationship with your therapist, and you're working through difficult emotions in real time with someone. For a problem that hinges on avoiding emotions, such as skin picking, working through and saying uncomfortable things and maybe hearing uncomfortable things in return, that is a part of the healing process. So changing your therapist should be the absolute last line, but sometimes it really does happen that we just simply don't get enough from the therapist anymore. Maybe they don't have anything new to offer us. Maybe we don't have anything to give to them. So in that sense, this is also a possibility, because another therapist might have an approach that will open up some doors for you that were previously closed. You can consider additional treatments as well. You can consider using supplements, maybe even medication in certain cases, especially if very intense anxiety is what triggers your picking and you're not willing or able to use very effective but demanding ways of reducing anxiety through mindfulness, for example, or therapy, then medication might be something that will reduce triggers. If you have ADHD, medication might actually be helpful. Although medication and ADHD is and the relationship to picking is complex, but for many people that would be very helpful. And then joining a support group or finding an accountability partner, so aside from having a therapist, is something that I would highly recommend. This, I saw this is like one of those generic images that you can find online. I saw this person in the second row and I thought, this person looks actually like me, like the hair is very similar. He wears glasses like me. I like half of my shirts are this color. Very weird. I don't remember being on a Zoom call this big ever. And also this one woman above looks like Susan Collins, and I'm absolutely certain I was never on the same call with her. So I assume it's not me, but it's even like a long name. Anyways, try joining a support group. This is quite helpful. Support groups, first of all, you have a group of people that you can vent to and complain, and people who will really intimately understand you. This is a kind of understanding that I don't think a therapist can necessarily offer, regardless of what their experience with speaking, personal experience that is. If they have it or if they don't have it, their professional role as a therapist is such that they can't offer something that people who are your friends and people who are on the same journey as you are can offer. So support groups can really be very unique. They can, hearing other people's perspectives can really dislodge you from the way you think, and they can give you completely new perspectives to something that you wouldn't think of in a million years. It's very useful to vent, because once you vent your frustration, what remains might be fertile ground for change. And then also support groups are very good to keep you accountable, providing that you attend them with any kind of regularity. If you're not in the program, we also have free support groups, and there are other support groups out there as well. So, you can, it shouldn't be that difficult to find a support group or a place where you can write and get some kind of useful feedback from others. So someone who's not a therapist. If you have a family member that you trust, they can also be very useful as support in those periods of time. Your accountability partner, I have to say, doesn't have to be someone who struggles with BFRBs. It's excellent if they are. It's like having a sponsor in AA. So you have someone who knows exactly what you're going through, but it can be a friend who has a problem of their own and they're dealing with it. And it's enough sometimes to just have weekly check-ins with them and then decide what you will do during the week. So, and then once you meet next time, you can assess how well you did. That alone can be sufficient. Right. But as long as it's someone who has work of their own to do, because then accountability is not a one-way street. So you'll never feel like you're burdening someone. It is a mutually useful relationship. And also something that I briefly touched on, and I will expand upon a little bit here, which is what exactly is the issue that you should be dealing with? I gave you the example of my client for whom picking and trauma would kind of overlap. So in certain periods in her life, trauma was something to work on and not picking. So picking may be something that she puts or chooses to put up front and say, this is what I want to work on. But psychologically, when you look at what's more important to resolve, picking simply isn't number one anymore. In that case, it just might be okay to accept that a certain amount of picking, wherever you are when you start stagnating, is something that you might have to deal with, in the next couple of months or whatever time you need to deal with this other issue. But resolving the other issue, which is more timely, is indirectly also working on picking. So because picking sometimes, because it gives you that relief and because it is so soothing, if you don't have other ways of self-soothing and you have a burning issue that you need to resolve, then even an imperfect way of self-soothing is better than no self-soothing at all. So sometimes it's okay to respect the fact that you might just be picking more in this period of your life. I'm not saying that you should accept that as something that you will do forever, that you should pretend that it's a healthy thing to do. No, none of this. Just that this is something something that right now cannot be better than it is. One of the things that gets us through therapy is patience. So that is a great virtue to have. This is maybe a bit of a heavy slide, and it may not sound very optimistic, but this is something that happens in therapy, so it is important to acknowledge that. Especially when you start a program like skin pick that is specifically geared towards skin picking, because in one-on-one, like in real life therapy, you can address different issues, and then spontaneously sometimes speaking will go away, won't be as present in sessions as something else will, because you will spontaneously bring whatever is important in your life. But when you have a program that focuses specifically on picking, you might start feeling like a failure just because now might be a time to pause with it, or at least to, I don't know, reduce the amount of effort and energy you put into it. It's funny how I will have so many clients who will say, I won't write in the next 2 weeks. Don't count on me because I have a lot of work to do. But when it comes to psychological issues, that might be, they'll say, I'll put up with picking because I want to get that higher salary. But when it comes to other areas of mental health, that trade-off doesn't seem to be as motivating. But sometimes it is a necessary evil. Whatever you do when it comes to changing treatment or feeling tempted to give up on yourself, do not make any sudden decisions. Like that should always be a rule in therapy. Create a schedule for yourself, something very basic. If you're in our program, say I will check in twice a week and write to my therapist. You don't have to open new sessions. You don't have to go in depth. Just check in, write what you did well, what was challenging, what lessons you learned, like just these basic things. And then when you become comfortable with that schedule, intensify it a little bit. So just slowly kind of put more pressure on yourself, but don't overwhelm yourself. Do regular evaluations. If your journal have structure a prompt that you will do monthly, for example, and then go over all the competing responses you've tried, all the, I don't know, relaxation techniques you've tried, what coping skills you've learned, what is it you need to do better, what were your failures, what lessons you learned from them. So do these regular evaluations. Do them with your therapist, do them on your own. Pay attention to your self-talk. Once stagnation sets in, negative self-talk skyrockets very quickly. So be very mindful of that, because the more negative self-talk you have, the more you will stagnate. Just recently, I wrote this like a little blog post about 2 types of negative self-talk that I see very frequently with my clients who struggle with picking. It's the inner critic and then the inner perfectionist. The inner critic is there to just make you look horrible at all times. So you might as well win the Nobel Prize, and the inner critic will take a look at that Nobel Prize and say yes, but Madame Curie has 2 of them and you only have 1, so you suck. So the inner critic is that part of you that just wants to demean you and devalue you at all times. And when that part notices that you're stagnating, it's going to attack immediately. So you have to be mindful of that as well. And then maybe learn some diffusion techniques so that you can distance yourself a little bit from that part of you. And then the other is the inner perfectionist. The perfectionist is not as malevolent as the critic, which makes him more dangerous, because you can easily recognize the critic as being the bad guy. But the perfectionist has good intentions. The perfectionist just wants everything to be perfect. So it presents itself, or not presents itself, but it has benevolent motives, but the messages that it sends you all translate into you're just not good enough. You know, you did your competing responses 5 times out of 7. You could have done them twice more. You know, you worn gloves 4 out of 5 days a week, and then the inner perfectionist says, yeah, but you really should be wearing them 5 out of 5 days. So the inner perfectionist is maybe not as harsh as the inner critic, but it is more insidious and more damaging because it can go on for a very, very long time. And it will to you, it might actually seem like you're trying to improve. But the problem, of course, with the inner perfectionist, it is that he or she chases after a goal that doesn't actually exist, as perfection doesn't exist. So you have to be very careful about how that internal dialogue goes when you start stagnating. Sometimes that is exactly what will bring you into this stage of stagnating, because for every small failure, these two voices, or at least one of them, I hope you don't have both of them at the same time, because I can't imagine the annoying, evil noise that would make. Like that little voice will whisper in and say, you know, if you couldn't do this, how do you expect to recover? And then when you listen to that all the time, you're bound to stop progressing at a certain point. Because our inner voices are like trolls online. Like you just cannot win a battle with them. The best thing that you can do is just ignore them. And then, of course, don't push yourself faster than you can go. Just respect the pace that you need to change. Sometimes we surprise ourselves and do some things and achieve some things rather quickly. But then in some other domains, we need more time. And when we go to therapy, those are usually the domains that need more time. So that's all I have for you. And now we will go to the Q&A. Before we go, I'm going to close the poll for this month and see what we'll be talking about in October. So let me see. I will share the results if you care to see them. From what I can see, the topic that you've chosen is the runner-up from last month. It's self-worth, self-compassion, and skin picking. So that will be our topic for next month. So let me start with the Q&A.